I always wanted to be let off at the corner because I didn't want my friends to see where I lived. I didn't want them to know my dad was a gardener. All I could do was think of, why couldn't I be someone else? And that's the ultimate self-hatred, is wanting to be someone else.
I never knew my dad felt this way about himself or my Ji-chan. I always thought of him as this proud Asian American filmmaker. So I guess it's just hard to learn that he was so ashamed of who he was. And it hurts even more to know that he had no one to talk to, no one to help him understand what was going on or how to cope.
We'll discuss race and how it plays a factor, and how we didn't even talk about this topic because we were afraid.
A Black Executive Perspective.
We are coming to you live from the new BEP studio for another thought-provoking episode of a Black Executive Perspective podcast, a safe space where we discuss all matters related to race, culture, and those uncomfortable topics that people tend to avoid. I'm your host, Tony Tidbit. So before we get started on this fantastic episode, I want to give a friendly reminder to all of you out there in the stratosphere. Make sure you check out our partners at Code M Magazine, whose mission is to save the Black family by first saving the Black man. So you definitely want to check them out at codemmagazine.com. That is codemmagazine.com. So today, we dive into the crossroads of filmmaking, DE&I, and Asian American history with an award-winning documentary producer and director, Eurie Chung. From an unexpected path into the industry to making of Third Act, we'll uncover the creative and financial hurdles of bringing diverse stories to the screen. At a time when DE&I faces growing resistance, we will discuss the persistent barriers to amplifying marginalized voices, and will also bridge the past and present, examining how a pivotal Asian American legal battle shaped U.S. citizenship rights and why those historical struggles still resonate in today's policies. So let me tell you a little bit about my good friend Eurie Chung. She's a documentary producer dedicated to amplifying Asian American narratives through film. As a head of Flash Cuts, alongside her partner, Walt Louis, she has spent nearly 2 decades supporting filmmakers across all facets of production and post-production. Her diverse body of work includes the documentary we're going to talk about today, Third Act, which was at Sundance, Forever We Are Young, that was at South by Southwest, as well as the acclaimed PBS docuseries Asian Americans, which earned a 2020 Peabody Award. Most recently, she directed a documentary short, I Can't Keep Quiet. She's a 2024 Sundance Producer Lab Fellow, and Eurie continues to champion underrepresented voices in the industry. Eurie Chung, welcome to a Black Executive Perspective podcast, my sister.
Hi, Tony. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for coming. Look, you making films all over the place, right? And they're being recognized all over. I mean, I love it. Oh my God, Peabody Award winner, and the Sundance, and oh my God, just a lot of great things. So we're excited that you're able to come on today and share your story and talk about Asian American culture and just educate everyone on something that, to be honest, in my opinion, has not been elevated in the way it should be elevated, across all platforms and spectrums. But before we get into the heavy stuff, let's learn a little bit more about you. So tell us where you're currently residing and a little bit about your family.
Sure. I'm based in LA. Weather's colder than it should be, but I'm soft now. I live here with my partner and our cat and dog.
So who runs the house, the cat or the dog?
The cat absolutely runs the house.
Yeah, you know why I asked that? because it's no different in my house, right? My dog, our dog is like 80 pounds. The cat may be 8 pounds or 10
Yeah,
pounds, and the cat runs the house. Dog is afraid of the cat.
exactly. The cat
Same.
always goes to the highest position in the room and looks down on all of us.
You know, it's funny. Our dog, the cat knows Fluffy. That's her name. She knows that Tucker is afraid of her. So when he tries to come down the stairs, she'll stand at the bottom of the stairs on purpose. Or if he's
Yeah,
trying to come
yeah,
upstairs, she'll stand up there and he'll get stuck
exactly.
on the stairs and he'll start crying. And then we're like, what's wrong? And then we'll look and Fluffy's standing at the top of the
Yeah.
stairs, like, yeah, what are you gonna do? All right. And we got to make Fluffy move so he can go up and down the stairs. So it's interesting. So at least we know that we're not the only ones that the cat
No,
runs the house with the dog.
no, absolutely not.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, cool. So listen, you have a very busy schedule, my friend. You're doing a lot. So the question I have, why did you want to come on a Black Executive Perspective podcast, talk about this topic?
Sure. A director I've worked with before, Alana Trackman, who directed Ain't No Back to a Merry-Go-Round, said that she had a great experience coming on your podcast, and that that I should talk to you. And I feel like what you're doing here with the podcast is really about diversity in a real way, which I think gets lost sometimes in the conversations, right? We always, like you said, tiptoe around it. It's hard conversations, and I think I appreciated the fact that you want to address things head on, and it's a lot of my work, so it seemed like it was a good fit.
Well, thank you for that. And more importantly, we're glad that you're here to talk about this important topic. And guess what? We're not going to tiptoe around this one as well. So, you ready to talk about it, my friend?
Yes, it's ready to talk.
All right. So, let's talk about it. So, look, one of the things when I was, doing some research on you and just seeing all the incredible things that you were doing, and, especially your movie Third Act, which we'll dive into shortly. But, I am intrigued by how somebody has a plan to do one thing and then they end up doing something totally different. So, you had planned to pursue a master's degree in social work out at UCLA, right? But then you took a totally different direction, and then you got into filmmaking. So talk a little bit about that, how that pivot, that you were on the yellow brick road of getting a master's degree in social work, and you got off in the woods and started doing something else. Talk to us about that.
Sure. I often ask myself the same question. Um, But it was important to me to go to UCLA and pursue a master's degree in Asian American Studies. That was first and foremost. Social work, you can kind of get a degree at a number of institutions. But I found that, UCLA was offering both. So that's kind of like pushed me kind of to the coast, if you will, from
Hmm.
Connecticut and Boston, where I had spent most of my life. And the way the program's structured, the first year is all Asian American Studies, and then you start your social work degree. And I think just being immersed in the history and the issues, and like taking that documentary class with Bob Nakamura, who's the subject of Third Act, it just really opened my eyes to the possibilities of media in a way that I hadn't understood until I got there. So if ultimately what I wanted to do with social work is kind of understand Asian American experiences, increase empathy for Asian American communities, and like basically, I wanted to work in institutions and kind of support Asian American people and communities and mental health and all of those things. And I felt like I didn't want to do that outside of having this grounding in Asian American studies. So, you know, I think when I think back on it now, what I was able to find in filmmaking was like a creative way to do that, what I wanted to do in social work. And instead of being more individualized in kind of what I was doing, I could make a film that would like, it could be seen by a lot of people and have a different kind of impact.
Right.
And that ended up sort of like, in some ways, I think I'm still social working, social workering, but like through film, because the kind of content that I'm doing is focused on those communities and giving people a voice so that like other people who see them feel empowered to kind of reclaim their stories and maybe delve into topics that they wouldn't have
Right.
otherwise, like things that they were
Right.
afraid to talk about or things that hadn't been discussed really. Um, so I think that's sort of how it happened, and it makes sense now looking back. But at the time, it seemed a little insane to
Yeah. I
just
mean,
completely drop social work as like a practical career.
it always makes sense later after you've gone through the journey. But, I'm always interested to hear how people, ended up where they are, right? A lot of kids go to school to get a degree. They end up getting a degree, and the majority of them end up working in something totally different
Yeah.
than the degree that they got, right? Now, you talked about growing up in Connecticut and Boston, out here on the East Coast, which, it's not, La La Land or movie making land or anything like that. I will say now there's a lot more television shows and movies being produced out here on the East Coast, or in Connecticut and Boston, but not to the LA. So growing up out here, did you, even though you were pursuing social work, did you see yourself being a storyteller in those early days?
It's time to rethink your protein. AgileLab's protein bars are crafted with high-quality protein, double the leucine, and enriched branched-chain amino acids, essential for optimal muscle recovery. Finally, a protein bar that works as hard as you do. So visit agilelabs.com and use the code BEP to get 20% off. That's agilelabs.com, promo code BEP.
I feel like, if I was like a little kid growing up, like I wanted to be a writer. It just didn't seem practical, right? Like a novelist or, something like that. And I just didn't think it was something that I was allowed to do, really,
Mm.
despite being an English major or whatever at college. So I think I knew that I was drawn to storytelling. I just didn't understand what role I would have in it or if there even really was one for me. But I also like
So
grew up like addicted to TV, and I think it didn't occur to me that that's a job. Like someone actually has to write that and make those stories. So
no, so when you say you didn't think and I'm paraphrasing, didn't have the right to do it, what do you mean by that?
I just, in addition to just having immigrant Korean parents, who probably wouldn't accept that, like you want to be successful, like I was working from the age of 15 or whatever, you don't want to have your parents worried about you, right? Like that. And that's why they always push you towards like the more traditional jobs of it's very stereotypical lawyer, doctor, like those are the things that
Right.
make sense to them. I knew I didn't want to do those things, but I also I didn't understand like what do you do if you want to be a writer? You just like wake up one day and like go to your word processor and just start typing things, and
Right.
then what happens? Like I didn't
Right.
understand. Like you get an agent and it's like, but it's it's a difficult process. Like in some ways it's like a 1 in a million lottery ticket, right? So like
Right.
I think I understood instinctively that it would be hard to navigate that, or even if I wanted to become a writer. So it's maybe I didn't give myself the permission in terms of like being allowed to, right? It's not like no one, I never said out loud, I want to be a writer, and someone said, no way. Like it
Right.
wasn't that. I think
But
I
it's
was
what
like,
you thought in your own mind,
correct, right,
right?
right. Like
Yeah.
I was limiting myself in terms of like, well, what is realistic? What is possible? Like maybe I was overly pragmatic, as a kid. I wasn't like dreaming about unicorns and, like the Hollywood or anything. So,
Well, I think
yeah.
also to your point, though, right? Our parents drop seeds in our minds in terms of what they think we could be or what they perceive as a great career. They want the best for us. And then there's not a lot of dreaming outside of that. Okay, so very rarely somebody says, "Oh, I think you could be a writer," or "I think you could be a director," or "I think you could," or "you could be president of the United States." So why don't you, So those things, your parents don't 9 times out of 10 don't say those things, right?
Yep.
They say to your point, the practical things in terms of because they want you to, obviously be better than them, and those careers that they plant are, safe, conservative careers that people do become successful at them. Let me ask you this. When I was coming up in Detroit, Michigan, and I had my first like racial awakening when I was 10 years old. And I don't want to say from that time, maybe it was earlier to be honest, but I started really diving into African American history. I really wanted to know more about my people's history, where I come from. Where did Black people come? I mean, you go to school and you get a limited version or just a little taste of those things, right? And so, I just wanted, and we didn't have iPhones and stuff to that nature. You had to go to the library, and I would read all these type books and really dive into understanding where I came from, what's the struggle of African American people here, and it really helped shape my perspective. Right? Talk a little bit about you growing up and what background shaped your perspective where you started saying, you know what, I want to start pushing and start promoting and diving into Asian American stories?
Yeah, so I Korean Americans, there's a big evangelical church culture. I don't know if you're aware of, but like a lot of Korean community in the United States is built around a church, Methodist, I don't know, Presbyterian, whatever, but like
Mm-hmm.
mostly those denominations. And that is the context in which I understood being Korean. Like I didn't, like outside of my family, I experienced being Korean through going to church every Sunday, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
So just
it
real quick,
was,
when you said
yeah.
you experienced being Korean going to church, so dive deeper into that. How's experiencing Korean going to church every Sunday? Tell me a little bit more about that.
I mean, that's where you saw most of the Korean people you would interact with. It's not
Got
like
it.
you wouldn't see them at like school, for example,
Got
right?
it.
Like they're maybe my cousin or something, but like
Right.
it wasn't like there were a bunch of Korean kids at school. And so, where you hear the most Korean spoken, like where all your social interactions with the Koreans as like a group, as opposed to your parents or your siblings, that all happened at church. So it was very social in addition to like, Bible study and sermons and all that. Um, and like I honestly felt like a little bit of an outsider most of the time because I felt like I was like a weirdo, like I wasn't I don't know what it I just never quite fit in for whatever reasons. Um, and if I'm being totally honest, like once I got to high school and started learning about like the civil rights movement and all that stuff, I was like very jealous of Black churches. Like that
Mm.
experience felt like, whoa, like they're political, but but it comes, it's like they're actually talking about these issues in church, whereas like,
Because it was grounded in the church, right?
right. So it's like it wasn't just religion or
Correct.
Christianity. It was like actually like how are we practicing these concepts, right? But like I felt like we were just like learning about things in a very like maybe it's just because Koreans felt they weren't part of American society, like we
Mm.
like existed in parallel things, but like we never talked about politics or like actually things that were happening outside our front door. We would just be like very insular, and that was something that always bothered me about church. And
Mm.
so when I would like I just remember just being like enamored with like Martin Luther King and his speeches and like literally going to Barnes and Noble or whatever, in high school and buying a book of his speeches because like
Mm-hmm.
that was the way that like oh like what he's talking about feels very real to me. I'm not Black, but like he's speaking about things that I think are important, like social
Right.
justice, poverty, all of these things that I felt like we were ignoring in the Korean church. So I think that in terms of like a racial awakening, I was very in tune with like the Black civil rights movement, and I like devoured as much as I could about that. And I remember watching Eyes on the Prize, like either in high school or college, and just being like, "Whoa, look at this!" And it took me a while to figure out like, oh, Asian Americans have that too. We just don't learn about it.
Right,
Like
right.
there was a similar like awakening of like, oh, we need to be taught this stuff. Like we should be taught this stuff, and like who's going to teach us and how are we going to figure those things out? So that's I got a little taste of it. I got basically none in high school. I got a little taste of it in college through like 2 or 3 courses, and then I was like, I this is why I need to go to UCLA. Like I need to go up to a place where like this is actually like an established discipline and curriculum, and they have history and they're teaching us. Like talking to people my parents' age who were actually born here, and I'm not like diminishing the immigrant experience, but like I could relate to them because they understood my experience as like the child of immigrants, even though they were older, right? So like it was sort of coming into contact with this older generation who had fought to get this knowledge and teach this
You
to
talking about the
people.
people at UCLA?
Yeah,
Got it.
yep.
Got it. Got it. Got it.
The
Got it. Got it.
professors at UCLA who were, actually like doing the work, and people like Bob who were actually part of, almost birthing this idea of ethnic studies and Asian American studies.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You know, it was interesting as you tell this, and you know, we never met. We're sitting here on the podcast sharing stories, and what's interesting is that you know part of what I did is part of what you did, right? Is that you got a taste of what was going on, and then you started wanting more, and you started going and researching it, and reading books and watching movies, and you know that for me was a sense of pride, right? Because I wanted to know more about what was going on, and I wanted, you know, to make sure that our people was always advancing, all right, and moving forward. And so it's interesting you're telling me that and saying, hey, civil rights movement was something that, was speaking to me as well, and, made me go. And so that is awesome. And then you went out to LA and you met Bob, who is the star of the documentary, Third Act, which is about his life. So talk a little bit about Third Act, and tell everybody, how did it start? Why is it important? And a lot about Bob, because that guy, the majority of people, the Asian godfather of movie making, I believe that's what his title is. So tell us more about Bob.
Sure. Bob Nakamura, he was actually incarcerated in Manzanar when he was 6 years old. And so that experience shaped his life
And
tremendously.
just to be clear, because most people don't know what Manzanar is. So
Sorry. Manzanar is a Japanese American concentration camp that happened in the wake of the bombing of Pearl Harbor in World War II, where FDR signed an executive order stating that anyone of Japanese descent was a potential enemy, and needed to be removed from their homes and incarcerated. And so they built, I'm sorry that I don't know the exact number, but they built various camps in remote areas, throughout
like
the
10 or
West
11
Coast.
of them, I think it was.
Yeah.
10 or 11 camps, yeah.
So Manzanar is close to Mount. Sorry, I forget the mount. It's about 3 hours away from LA on your way up to Mammoth Mountain. That stretch of road. It's high desert. It's super cold, dusty, windy, isolated away from everything. And so what had happened with, obviously there's a huge number of Japanese Americans in Los Angeles. They were given very little notice to sell their things, pack up what they could carry, and board a bus that would take them oftentimes first to Santa Anita racetrack, where they actually had to sleep in horse stalls. And then from there, while they were building the actual barracks in which they would come to live later, then they would be moved to those camps.
And these were U.S. citizens. correct?
Majority US citizens, a lot of them may have been immigrants, but they had children who were here, children who were born here. And the total number is about 120,000 who were taken to live in these camps, and they were not released until the end of the war.
Mm. And Bob and he experienced that as a 6-year-old.
Yes, so you see his photo of him and attending elementary school, with all the other kids his age. So he is sort of the younger end, I guess, of like kind of the last generation of survivors,
Correct,
people of that
right.
age, right now, because he's 89 now. Um, anyway, that once the civil rights movement actually happened in the 60s, he started to be like, wait, what is this camp? I went to this camp, like we never talk about it. And like he ended up partnering with people a little bit younger than him who were not in the camps, but were children of people who had been in the camps. And they were like, we want to know what this is. Let's march to Manzanar. And like they're like, oh wait, it's like 300 miles away or something. So um it became this discovery. It's like that first pilgrimage in 1969 was a huge moment of discovery and racial awakening and personal identity and things, and it ended up becoming an annual pilgrimage eventually, where they would take buses of people up to see the site, and then it became a national park, and all of these things. So Bob, I think, understanding the power of that moment of discovering his, that his history is actually connected to US history, American history. He moved from being a photographer to basically being like a documentary filmmaker, where he's one of the earliest people to document the experience of Japanese concentration camps in the United States.
I have a clip I want to play from Third Act that kind of speaks to exactly what you said. So let's play the clip right now, then I want to hear your thoughts after.
My life changed around totally in the 70s when the anti-war movement and Asian American movement started. It was like we were building something, a whole new concepts like ethnic studies, and you could see progress. We were questioning white society in general. Everything I did before I began to look at as kind of bullshit. I had all the skills, and now the movement gave me the content for my work. The movement more or less solved all my problems, my artistic problems, my identity problems, my sense of self-worth, sense of belonging. It gave meaning to my life.
So, wow. I mean, here's a guy who's known as the godfather of Asian American films is saying the movement gave him, there was an awakening for him. And I love the part he said it helped me find my identity. Okay. So speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that his gift as a teacher was to give that to all of us, who took his class, which is that, this isn't just a course, Asian American Studies 101 or something, like in sharing his experience and awakening with learning about that history, I think he gave us all that gift, which is to be like, take this knowledge, but like, you don't have to necessarily, go out and make films, but like it should transform you, right? Like this knowledge
Right.
should have an impact on you personally, because like I'm not Japanese American specifically, but this concept of Asian American is actually kind of a radical concept, that
Mm.
people whose ancestors come from Asia, which is like, dozens of languages that we cannot communicate with each other, back home, but that like our faces, kind of, put us together in a group, but that there can be power in that. And there's power in
Yes.
understanding the origins of, ethnic studies and Asian American studies, that when we did come together and demand those things, in the 60s in SF State and Berkeley, that happened also in unity with the Third World Liberation Front and Black Power activists and, Latino activists, Chicano activists, American Indian activists. So like, I think that's really what I took from Asian American studies is like, it's very empowering to be able to own your own story and to know it and to see the value in it. And I think it does open you up. It opens your mind in a different way to like what is possible. Like we don't have to be, just always functioning from like a place of invisibility or visibility or, deficit or, whatever. Like, oh, well, no one did this for us. So it's like, no, they're never going to do it for you, right? Like, but once you have this knowledge, you can go forward and make the path that you want to build for others. So that's Bob as the godfather, right? He made a path for us as media makers, as creative people, as, Asian Americans, to know this history and then like, move forward with it and take it into a different direction. And that's sort of how Third Act became what it became.
But he also did that with his son, right?
Exactly.
Because
Yeah.
his son,
Yeah.
is the one that wanted to make the movie Third Act about his father. So speak a little bit about that as well.
Yeah. So Tad Nakamura is Bob's son. Tad actually went to UCLA as an undergrad, took his father's class, learned at the foot of masters, if you will. But I think he was surprised that he was good at it. I think Bob was surprised that he wanted to, follow in his footsteps and not do something totally different. But the film kind of just started out as like, maybe we should do a short film that tells people about Bob Nakamura's career because he's well known in certain communities, but definitely not on like a national scale.
Right.
Definitely not in terms of like really like if you're outside of the documentary community or the Asian American community, Japanese American community, you just may not know everything that he did. So it kind of started off as like, oh, maybe this is just like a biopic about this person's life who you should know about. So the process really started in 2018, where I think Tad was like, I'm going to raise money, I'm going to start, get some grants and, just start documenting this because my father is getting older, he's in his 80s. So, who knows how much time we have to do this. In the course of making the film, Bob was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And it just became clear that like, his speech was slowing down, his physicality, was not as robust as it was when they started. And so, the process of making the film was difficult because Tad actually, in his past films, has edited and directed them himself. And I think that this ended up being a little bit too personal in some ways for him to tackle. Like he didn't have the emotional distance in some ways to do it. And so he had asked me to produce, and I was like, that means a lot of different things to different people. Right? Like, what does producing mean for you? And I took the class Ethnocommunications at UCLA as a grad student with Bob as my instructor. He eventually became my thesis advisor, but Tad was part of the teaching staff at that point, even though he was still in school. So, I've known them since like 2003, and as a unit, essentially, right, that they're kind of both responsible for teaching me how to be a filmmaker. Tad and I have been friends since then, not best friends, but like we hang out socially. Like I've helped him on other films, but this is the first film where it was really like, okay, like I'm much more day to day in terms of like helping this get done. I think the Parkinson's diagnosis kind of forced us to face Bob's mortality.
If you like what you hear and want to join us on this journey of making uncomfortable conversations comfortable, please subscribe to a Black Executive Perspective podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Hit subscribe now to stay connected for more episodes that challenge, inspire, and lead the change.
And I think it forced Tad to realize that like a regular biopic is probably not going to do it. I remember one thing that I told him was like, frankly, I can make that version of the film about your dad. I know your dad well enough. I think he's comfortable enough with me, you know, that he would say what he needed to say. No one can make this film the version of the film that is your relationship as a filmmaker to your filmmaker father and how he has taught you how to make this film, right? Like that's a very different, it's a little bit meta, but it's a different film that no one else can make. So if you aren't a character in this and we're just watching Bob's life from here, from a distance, from any person observing his career, two very different films. So it was a
Yeah,
struggle.
and it seemed that, you know, I watched it, and number one, very sad, and very emotional. And when I say emotional, you know, I'm looking at it, obviously I'm looking at it from an audience point of view, but I put myself in Tad's position, where if that was my father, and, you know, as he opened up, I always saw my father as a superhero. And then you hear your father talk about his depression, um, and the things that he was going through that he didn't tell anybody about. And then you find out he has Parkinson's. And it was just, I can imagine how tough that was to, you know, create a movie that you want to honor your father and all the things that he has done. So people outside of the network or California or whatever that can really dive in and see how great of a man he is and what, you know, what type of work he has done and how many voices that he was able to amplify. But then at the same time, you're seeing your father's mortality, and your father is opening up to you and sharing things that you would never. Is not that's not a superhero. He's not infallible. He's not the man of steel. Okay, that it just blew me away. It was so emotional. It was a great documentary. But you had something to do with it as well, right? Because like you said, you've known them from over 20 years. And I believe you're trying to get him to finish this. And then obviously there was pushback. So talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, I think well, number one, it was getting an editor who wasn't Tad himself to look at the footage fresh and to be able to say like this, you know, you can't not everything can be super rosy, right? Like you need to be able to show what's real, you know, but it's like how far does that go? Because like you could keep filming forever, right? You're his
Right,
son, like
right,
he's not going to
right,
stop you.
right.
So, you know, like I think step one was like, okay, we actually need an editor with you know, just a little bit of emotional distance to help us wade through years of footage and figure out what is the actual through line here. um I will say that for a long time it felt like a biopic mashed with a personal story, right? That they weren't fully integrated in that
Right,
way where Tad
right,
felt like a character from the beginning. It
right.
kind of felt like we spent the first hour or so just learning about Bob's career.
Correct.
And then it was like, oh, and then things changed and I realized like, oh, this isn't the movie that I was going to make. Those things are all still in there. I think it was just how are we integrating it sooner so that I think Tad was kind of avoiding being in front of the camera, right? He's used to being behind the camera. So, you know, refining the narration that, you know, that has to come from him and all of that stuff. It's like, you know, we would go for a while being like, have you written a new pass of narration? It's like, no. Okay. It's like, when can we get that done? You know? But to I totally understand that it was very hard for him to face the film. You know, I think he has said in some interviews that like it was almost like if I finish the film, then my working relationship with my father's over, right? Because this is the last film that we're going to make together. So like in some ways it's drawing out that process. Like no one has that kind of relationship with each other like they do, right? And so if Tad is no longer making this film about Bob and they are father and son, right? Not filmmaker father and filmmaker son, and they're not talking shop like they are, then like it changes their relationship.
Right.
And as Bob, his health declines physically, it changes their relationship. Tad is much more of
Right.
a caretaker to his father than he was, even a couple years ago. So that, trying to be his friend, and support him in all that it must be like to have to go through that with a parent, um, on top of the pressure of making a film, right? Um, it's so personal, right? I mean, it's just so personal, and like I was like, yeah, it's tough to see Bob this way, right? Like I'm watching the footage, it's tough, but like kind of what Bob says in the film when there's a moment in the car where Tad's like, I could shoot everything. It's like, shouldn't I just be spending time with you and enjoying these holidays and moments we have together? And Bob's like, I think you just have to film and finish, get what you need and finish the film and move on. It's so practical, but like sometimes I felt that way too, but like I wasn't always, not allowed, but like it was hard to say that. Like it had to come from Bob in a way because he's like, I'm giving you permission, Tad, to,
Right.
finish the movie.
Right.
But
Right. It came out at the Sundance Film Festival. Talk a little bit about the reaction. And
yeah,
then was there any moments there when, the whole family was there that's like
yeah.
breathtaking?
So Bob actually had a film at Sundance years ago and called Toyo Miyatake Infinite Shades of Grey. And then Tad had a short film in 2006. So for them to be at Sundance together, like I think Bob's in a wheelchair now. He's it's Sundance is very hard to navigate when you're completely able-bodied, let alone, you know what I mean, like freezing cold in a wheelchair. So it took a lot for Bob to get there. But, Bob, his wife Karen, Tad's sister Ty, Tad's sister's kids, Gus and Mina, Tad's wife Cindy, and Tad's two kids, Prince, who was in the film, and Malaya. That whole crew, they were able to come, and it was pretty spectacular. So it's like the film plays right to like a 500-seat theater, and everyone's crying already because it's so emotional.
It is
And
emotional.
then we kind of like get ourselves together and we go up for the Q&A, and Bob gets wheeled up to the front. And I think if you don't know the family, you may not know that Bob was going to be there, right? So like there's this like added moment of like, oh my gosh, he's actually there. And then his wife Karen, Tad's mom, reads a statement that Bob wrote, which we were barely holding it together as it was. And then when she read his statement, I think we all lost it again. Because in the end, he was like, she was reading Bob's statement. He started by saying, I've seen many versions of the film over the years, but I wanted to wait and see the final version with you in the theater so we could all, experience it together, which was very sweet. And at the end, he says, Tad, I know this isn't a very JA or Japanese American thing to do, but I want to tell you that like I'm so proud of you and I love you. And I think like everyone we just couldn't
Yeah,
hold it together at that
I
point,
can imagine.
right? But yeah, it felt like we had the audience with us, from the get-go, and we never lost them. So when we got to the front, just seeing everybody, people came from the Bay Area, they came from LA, like people who worked on the film and who were just friends, of the family. I think Tad said one of his best friends from middle school booked a condo at Park City in October, which was before we even got into Sundance. He was like, I'm
Mm.
so confident that this film is great. Like having not seen a frame of it, he was like, you're going to get into Sundance. And he booked this lodging for him and his family. And I think that was like the energy, right, of the whole experience of Sundance, is that we're surrounded by so much love and support, not just for the film, but for us, as filmmakers.
That is awesome and it's beautiful. And I recommend everyone to check this out. It is really, really well done. Very sad, but also celebratory because you're celebrating a person that really came on this earth and found his calling and really inspired and brought up people like yourself and was able to amplify stories that we wouldn't really know about today. And you talked a little bit about when Tad, wanted to raise money for the film, right? And I don't know exactly what he went through, but talk a little bit about the battle to raise money for, Asian American stories, right? What challenges does Asian American filmmakers face when they're trying to get financing and distribution for their work?
Um, I mean, the landscape is obviously super challenging, regardless of the content that you're making. If you don't have like really A-list star power or some kind of Marvel, you know, IP behind what you're doing. Everyone says independent filmmaking is very getting increasingly difficult. And then you add the dimension of Asian American stories to it. I feel like it's always been a challenge to prove that there is a market for that material because it's I remember years ago talking to somebody and they told me that like when Nielsen ratings, uh clocks viewership and ratings, they for a long time, I don't know if this is true today, so I don't want to say for sure, but for a long time they classified Asian Americans as whites, saying that the buying patterns and the watching patterns were essentially so similar to whites that they wouldn't disaggregate that data separately. So like
But it was probably true.
yeah, so
Right,
it was basically impossible to track, right? Like
right.
what is the buying power, the viewership power of this demographic, and you know, at the end of the day, it's very hard to get something greenlit if you can't prove that people are going to watch it or buy tickets to it. It's like people don't really go to documentaries in the movie theater anyway. So, like
Right,
you have that
right, right,
element
right.
of it. I think right now documentaries, most people would say it's sort of saturated by star biopics and true crime. Those are the two that essentially quote unquote sell. Um, so it's like I've most of my work has been on PBS, so thank God for PBS, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, ITVS, Independent Lens, like um, those those programs or those strands are vital to people telling diverse stories because it is an investment, but it's not judged by the same metrics in terms of like profitability. If you were trying to go to a Netflix or something
Right,
like that
right,
due to it.
right, right.
So like I am super grateful to them for, ITVS particularly invested in this movie at the development stage and then also uh, provided production funding. And so it's like we have the privilege of knowing that it would have a home, on PBS. But I think the overall challenges are that sometimes you're just considered too niche. But then if as an Asian American filmmaker you don't do Asian American content, you're doing like, general, not specific, they'll be like, well, how can you speak to that? Like, why aren't you speaking about your own story? So it's like it's a little bit of a catch-22, and I think that all I can do is just say that like look at how resonant a film like Third Act can be across right race and
Yeah,
age. Yeah.
exactly. Across all races, right? Third act, to me is something that's why after I saw it, I was blown away and I kept thinking about it. But and the thing about it is it's so relatable to every community, father, a son. I mean, there's a lot of similarities in terms of what we deal with our children, with our parents, you know, and then seeing that they're not infallible. So there's a million things with that, right? That could go across. However, you have to be willing to, you know, see that and be willing to invest in it. Okay. Because a lot of times, you know, groups are put in boxes, and only Black people are going to watch Black stories. And that's not true. It's just not true. How good is the story? Is the story relatable? So, you know, those are the things that I'm glad that you're out there, that we have to continue to fight, and not just from an Asian American. It goes into, like I said, from African American, the whole 9 yards. The more you start slicing the onion up, and you put an onion in different boxes, all right, and it says only these people are going to watch this box, the struggle will continue to happen. However, you know, one of the things is that we know history repeats itself, okay? And, you know, right now where we are in America, you know, there's an attack on DEI. There's an attack on, muffling underrepresented groups. There's an attack on, you know, these groups are getting more than you, so we got to stop them. Okay, which we know is not true, but those are the narratives that are being pushed out, right? And then, you know, the administration came out with a narrative that they wanted to end birthright citizenship, okay? Which the majority of people don't even know where birthright citizenship started. They know nothing about the 14th Amendment, but I can tell you this, they don't even know this story about Wong Kim Ark, okay? Which, to be honest, in 1898 was the first person to be able to test the birthright citizenship. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that in Asian American history specifically, they tried to use the legal system as much as possible, like flood the courts with these kinds of cases. Like there's earlier cases of American-born Chinese girl being excluded from the white school, and their mother and father taking that case to the Supreme Court, saying, no, we have the right to an education and it should not be segregated, but it ended up being segregated anyway. So it is part of like Asian American history to use these legal cases to fight for their rights as citizens. Wong Kim Ark specifically is a kind of a crazy test case because it became so much bigger than this this one man who was born here, who was going back and forth between China and the US. And, you know, I think the third time he did it, he was basically imprisoned on the boat for 2 months while they decided whether or not he should have citizenship. He should be citizenship to the United States on the basis of where he was born, not his parents' citizenship. And like the arguments were crazy. It was like, that's not how they did it in Rome. Like the lawyers would go back and say, in Rome, it's just, you know, whatever your parents are, that's what you are, not where you physically were born. And it does go back to the 14th Amendment of like, if you basically undid birthright citizenship, the children of slaves would not be citizens.
And that's really what that was the key,
and
right?
Right. And so now they're trying to carve out Chinese people specifically as saying, well, we can let this group be citizens, but we can't let this group. And then the ultimate conclusion was that if you try to undo this, there's too many people. You're stripping citizenship from too many people, like every Italian, every German, what about the British people who have children here post, you know, the civil Revolutionary War. So it's like they recognized that it was just going to undo way too much. And it seems crazy to even think that they're even mildly considering this. I mean, Trump himself, isn't he the son of a German immigrant, I believe?
Well,
it's not logical anymore.
Okay? It just makes no sense, right? And they can't do nothing with it anyway. This is just a way to rile people up, right? But at the end of the day, you know, again, there's so much Asian American history that people are not aware of. that
That's American
discrimination,
history.
and that's American history, and that discrimination has been part of it from day. One thing that we're not even talking about was the Chinese Excursion Act. That's why they didn't want him to come back, because they didn't want the Chinese here in the United States. Okay, so you can go. So these things, what drives me crazy, Eurie, is that and I'm saying people of color, Black, Asian, Hispanic, you name it, we always put ourselves in silos, and we end up, fighting our own battle, thinking it's just us, when that's not true. Okay. And just like you said earlier, how when you started watching the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King and this and that, you felt a kinship to that. Okay. That, hey, I'm not Black, but you know what? I can empathize with what's going on, because that's happened, not the same 100%, but discrimination has happened to my group as well. Okay. And where we are today, we're so separated when we should be coming together and fighting these things together. Okay. And to me, we would have way more power. All right. See, the goal, the strategy is divide and conquer. Okay. So if we can divide them, get them to fight amongst themselves, we can conquer them. Okay. And that goes for white people too, because a lot of white people end up voting against their own interests because they fall into the divide and conquer thing. All right. And so, it's very important that we share these stories. Okay, not just from this group, from all groups. So then we can have a bigger holistic view and say, you know what? It ain't just us. It's them too. And it's also them and this and that. And you know what? I now understand what my Korean brothers and sisters go through, my Hispanic brothers and sisters go through, blah, blah, blah. And you know what? Maybe we should start working and building and coming together so we can all fight these things collectively. What's your thoughts on that?
No, 100%. I mean, I think where we are today is the result of us, not us, you and me, but the collective us, believing the lies that we have less in common with each other than with Trump and Musk, or you know what I mean? Like,
Correct.
there's nothing further from the truth, right? Is that most of us who are not billionaires have a lot more in common with each other. And they've also, I think, been very successful at like spreading the lie that there's not enough to go around. Because the money's all there. I mean, it's like literally the bank accounts of like 20 people in the United States. The money is there. It's just they'll use whatever excuse they can to not give it to you, not pay their taxes, not do the things that make it seem like there's an abundance. I think the US is the richest country in the world. Like it's crazy to think that anywhere in the United States anyone is going hungry, that anyone is going without housing, that like all of these social, quote unquote, social problems, they're not individual problems. They're actually social problems. They're societal problems and how we've dealt with them. But yeah, I mean, we're just as a collective believing the lie that we don't have things in common with each other, that we can't fight this, whatever this thing is, or that like the idea that diversity is the thing that's causing our downfall. Like the diversity is the thing that makes us strong and unique and special, and to downplay that or to make that the enemy is so misguided and really preying on people's fears.
That's
And
it.
it's working and it's sad.
That's
Honestly.
it. You hit it, my sister, you hit it right on the head. Divide and conquer. Okay? If we can divide them, we can conquer them. And you push narratives out there that's not true. But what you're really doing is you're tapping into people's fears. And when people are afraid, they're not thinking rationally. They'll believe anything, right?
Yeah.
But let me just ask you this. Final thoughts. What's the final thoughts that you want to leave the audience today, Eurie?
Oh, big question. I think I do think that if we truly listen to each other, and I think that if these stories, these very human, universal stories, like it's crazy how specific, no matter how specific you are, like that actually resonates more in some ways than this kind of these broad generalizations. But I think if we really did listen, like we could move forward for all people and not just for individuals. I think I saw a video clip the other day of a guy, an older gentleman who went to testify against trans. Some, some he was supposed to go and vote for support on a anti-trans bill, and he said, "I've been sitting here for an hour listening to these people talk about their experiences," and he's like, "They've changed my mind," you know. And he was an older white gentleman who came in one way and basically spoke into the microphone and said, "I listening here has changed my mind." And I think that truly that's why I'm drawn to storytelling, is that if you really do sit and listen to other people and other points of view, I feel like there's potential there, and we shouldn't downplay it. As it's easy to be cynical in these times. It's easy to be very, resigned to, we have, this side and this side, and we're never going to come together. I don't know what it's going to take, but I do think that it will have to involve listening. I don't know any other way that we're going to move forward.
I totally agree, my friend. Final question. How can a Black Executive Perspective podcast help you?
Yeah. Thank you for having me again. It's a great conversation. Yeah, watch films. Watch films that aren't about people who look like you. Thirdactfilm.com is our website. We have festivals going on, throughout this year. We won't be on PBS until probably next year, 2026. But if you follow us or sign up for our newsletter, you can find out when the film will be near you or on your TV. But yeah, I think honestly, just having me on, having the experience of sharing with you, talking with you, being able to talk about the film, it's been a great gift, and I appreciate the time and being able to be here with you.
Well, we appreciate you investing the time out of your busy schedule to come on and share. And that is thirdact.com. Is that correct?
Thirdactfilm.com.
Thirdactfilm.com. Make sure you check out thirdactfilm.com. See all these fantastic stories, educate yourself, and more importantly, share with others as well. So Eurie Chung, thanks for coming on a Black Executive Perspective podcast. We really enjoyed this. I want you to stay right there. I think it's now time for
Tony's Tidbit.
And so the tidbit today, marginalized voices don't need permission to be heard. They need platforms, resources, and the will to make it happen. If history has taught us anything, it is that the fight for justice is never over. It just takes on new forms. And you heard a lot of that today with my conversation with Eurie Chung. And please don't forget to check out the next Need to Know by Dr. Nasinga Burton. Dr. Burton dives into the timely and crucial topics that shape our community and world. You don't want to miss her insights and deepen your understanding on the issues. Check her out next Thursday on Need to Know by Dr. Nasinga. And then also don't forget to check out the next Pull Up, Speak Up, where you'll hear bold, unfiltered voices tackle the provocative issues. Our roundtable provides sharp perspectives, real talk, and a call to action. This is not a conversation, it's a revolution. So make sure you do not miss the next episode of Pull Up, Speak Up. So now it's time for BEP's call to action. And for our avid listeners, you know what our goal is, but if this is your first time watching a Black Executive Perspective podcast or listening, our goal is to eliminate all forms of discrimination. And how to do that, we've come up with an acronym called LESS, LESS. And L stands for learn. You want to learn about different racial and culture nuances to educate yourself. Then after you learn, you have the letter E, which stands for empathy. Now, since you've learned about new people and new cultures, now you can understand their point of view because now you can put yourself in their shoes. And then after empathy, you have the first S, which is share. Now you want to share what you've learned to your friends and colleagues so they can become enlightened as well. And then the final S is stop. You want to stop discrimination as it walks in your path. So if Aunt Jenny or Uncle Joe says something at the Sunday dinner table that's inappropriate, you say, Aunt Jenny, Uncle Joe, we don't believe that, we don't say that, and you stop it right there. So if everyone can incorporate less, LESS, will build a more fair, more understanding world, and we all will be able to see the change that we want to see because less will become more. Don't forget to follow A Black Executive Perspective on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can follow us on our social channels of LinkedIn, X, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at A Black Exec. For our fabulous guests, the award-winning producer, director, Eurie Chung, I'm Tony Tidbit. We talked about it today. We learned about it today. We love you. And now it's time for us to get out.
A Black Executive Perspective.